A price was placed on him, a price he would later make the world pay back. The auction block of Port Kazadvir stood at the edge of the sand sea like a wound that had never closed. 40 wooden steps, salt-rotted railings, a single iron ring driven into the boards where buyers tied the ones they had already paid for. The crowd that morning was thin because the storms had been thick that season, and most of the rich merchants had retreated inland to wait out the weather. The only buyers left were the ones who could not afford patience. He was the 7th body brought up that morning, and the cheapest. 16 years old, salt-burned skin the color of dark honey, hair the color of ash and silver matted with 2 months of caravan sweat. A brand on his right shoulder that read, in the looping script of the Southern slavers, the word Stormgrave. Not his name, the name of the network of slavers who had owned him last. A trademark, the way a butcher might mark a side of meat. He did not look at the crowd. He did not flinch when the auctioneer struck the gong. He did not open his mouth, because 2 years ago, someone had reached into his mouth with a pair of pincers and taken from it the one organ that could have told the world what had been done to him. He had no tongue. He had not spoken a word in 24 months. He had almost forgotten the sound of his own voice. The auctioneer, a fat man named Bereth Vilkrun, who had been selling people for 31 years, slapped the boy on the back and barked the opening price. 12 copper marks. 12. The price of a working donkey. The price of a small barrel of bad wine. The price of 2 goats. A hand went up in the back of the crowd. A desert merchant in a sun-bleached robe, his face half hidden behind a wrap of indigo cloth. Hassan al-Verakim. He owned a small caravan of 4 wagons that moved between the southern coast and the inland trading post of Korashtul, 3 weeks across the sand sea. He needed a body, any body. 12 marks was a fair price for a body. The auctioneer slapped the boy again. Sold. The merchant came forward, dropped 12 copper coins into the auctioneer's wooden bowl, and took the rope that bound the boy's wrists. The boy followed without resistance. He had learned long ago that resistance was a way of asking to be hurt, and that being hurt was a way of asking to be killed, and that being killed was, perhaps, the only thing in the world he was not yet ready for. Not because he wanted to live, but because he had not yet found the thing he was supposed to do before he died. I am RiseArc, dear viewer, and I have spent a long time inside this story, longer than I usually spend inside any story, because this one resisted me. It did not want to be told. The bones of it are scattered across 3 different cultures and 5 different centuries, and the truth of it has been buried under so many layers of fear and shame and deliberate silence that I had to dig with my hands. What I found, I am about to tell you. Sit with me. Stay with me. Because this is the story of a boy who could not speak, and the wind that learned to speak for him. His real name was Aerin Stormgrave, but he did not remember that yet. The brand on his shoulder was the closest thing to a name he had left, and the brand was a lie. The truth was older than the brand, older than the slavers, older than the empire that protected the slavers. The truth was waiting for him in the middle of the largest sandstorm in 40 years. But before the storm, there was the village. He was born on a strip of black rock coast, where fishermen had been pulling silver eels out of the cold green water for 9 generations. The village had no name on any map. The villagers called it Hollowtide because the bay there filled and emptied twice a day with a strange hollow sound, like a great throat swallowing. Aerin's father was a fisherman named Kalin, who had hands like worn leather. Aerin's mother was a woman named Miriel, who had eyes the color of wet slate, and who sang in a language none of the other villagers understood. She taught Aerin the language in secret, in the small hours before dawn, when the rest of the village was still asleep. She said the words were medicine. She said the words would protect him. He was 11 years old when the raiders came. They came in the dark, in 3 black-sailed ships, and they came not for cargo, but for people. They burned the boats. They burned the nets. They burned the houses with the doors barred from the outside. Aerin saw his father pinned to the wall of their hut with a spear through his throat, and he saw his mother run toward him with her arms open and her mouth open, and a sound coming out of her mouth that was not a scream, but a word. One of the old words she had taught him in the dark before dawn. The word never reached him. A raider's club came down on the back of her head before she could finish it. They took Aerin. They took 6 other children. They put them in the bottom of one of the black-sailed ships, and they sailed south for 11 days. And at the end of those 11 days, they sold the children at a market on the coast of the Sand Sea. Aerin was sold 3 times in the next 5 years. Each owner was worse than the last. The 3rd owner discovered that Aerin remembered the faces of the men who had killed his father, and that Aerin had begun, late at night, in whispers no louder than the breath of a sleeping cat, to repeat their names, to memorize them, to pray them the way other children prayed for bread. The 3rd owner did not want a slave with a memory. He took Aerin into a back room one evening, and he held Aerin down on a wooden table, and he reached into Aerin's mouth with a pair of iron pincers, and he took the tongue. He did it slowly. He did it in front of the other slaves so that they would understand what happened to slaves who remembered things. When it was done, he poured cheap wine into the wound to stop the bleeding, and he laughed when Aerin's body convulsed from the pain, and he said, "Now you will never tell anyone anything ever again." This was 2 years before the auction at Port Kazadvir, 2 years before Hassan al-Varakim paid 12 copper coins for him. 2 years of silence so complete that Aerin had begun to wonder if he had ever been able to speak at all, or if speaking was a dream he had once had and could no longer remember the details of. Now, dear viewer, hold that picture in your mind for a moment. A boy with no tongue. A boy who has forgotten the sound of his own voice. A boy who has been sold 3 times for the price of livestock. A boy whose mother died trying to say a word he never heard the end of. Hold that picture, because the next thing I am going to tell you is going to change everything. The caravan of Hassan al-Varakim left Port Kazadvir at dawn on the 2nd day of the month the desert people call Threshing Moon. 4 wagons, 16 camels, 11 slaves including Aerin, 6 armed guards. Hassan rode at the front on a white camel and sang to himself as the dunes rose around them. He was in a good mood. The journey to Korash Tul was profitable in any season, but the autumn run, with its cargo of inland silk and southern dates, was the one that paid for his wives' silver and his son's education. He had bought Aerin to replace a slave who had died of fever 3 weeks earlier. He did not think about Aerin again for 4 days. On the 5th day, the wind changed. The caravan masters of the Sand Sea know the wind the way fishermen know the tide. They know its songs. They know its silences. They know which winds bring rain to the north, and which winds bring locusts from the east, and which winds bring nothing but the slow, patient grinding of sand against bone. On the morning of the 5th day, the wind that rose out of the south was none of these winds. It was a wind no caravan master alive had ever heard before. It came low and slow and warm, and it carried in it a smell that was not the smell of sand or salt or grass, but the smell of something older, the smell of stone that has not been touched by light for 1,000 years. Hassan al-Varakim was not a stupid man. He knew the wind was wrong. He ordered the caravan to make camp in the shelter of a long dune and to wait. The wind grew stronger through the afternoon. By sunset, the sky to the south had turned the color of an old bruise, and the air had become so thick with suspended sand that the camels began to scream and pull at their tethers. By midnight, the storm was on them. It was the largest sandstorm to strike the Sand Sea in 40 years. The chroniclers of Korash Tul, who keep records of such things, would later write that the storm lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and that the wind, during the worst of it, reached speeds that bent iron tent poles like reeds. 2 of Hassan's guards were lost in the first night. They walked out into the wind to check on the camels, and they did not come back. The wind ate them. By the 2nd night, Hassan had begun to come apart. He was a man who lived by routine and profit, and the storm was destroying both. He paced inside the largest of the wagons, kicking at the slaves who lay chained on the floor, screaming at his remaining guards, drinking from a leather flask of date wine that he refilled 3 times in as many hours. He needed someone to blame. He needed an enemy he could see, and in the corner of the wagon, chained by the ankle to an iron ring, was the mute boy he had bought for the price of 2 goats. He decided the boy was the cause of the storm. It was not a rational decision. Hassan was drunk, and he was afraid, and he was a man who had spent his whole life believing that the world was structured by signs and curses and the will of unseen forces. The boy had been bought cheap. The boy had a brand that read, Stormgrave. The boy had not spoken a single word in the 4 days he had been with the caravan. And silent slaves, in Hassan's experience, were always the ones carrying curses. He pulled Aerin off the floor by his hair. He dragged him to the door of the wagon. He kicked the door open and threw the boy out into the storm. The wind hit Aerin like a wall. He could not breathe. The sand was so thick in the air that his eyes filled with it instantly, and the pain of it was so sharp that he fell to his knees with his hands pressed against his face. Hassan came down out of the wagon behind him, screaming in the desert tongue, calling Aerin a curse and a demon and the son of a demon, and Hassan had a length of thick knotted rope in his hand, and Hassan began to beat him. Aerin did not try to crawl away. There was nowhere to crawl. The storm was the whole world. The blows came down across his back and his shoulders and the side of his head, and each blow drove him further into the sand. And somewhere in the middle of it, Aerin opened his mouth to scream, because that is what bodies do when they are being beaten to death. But no sound came out, because 2 years ago, a man had taken his tongue, and the wind heard him anyway. I want you to understand, dear viewer, what happened next, because what happened next is the hinge on which this entire story turns, and the chroniclers who would later write about it would disagree about almost every detail, but they would agree about this. The wind heard him. Not the sound he could not make, the thing inside the sound, the thing that was supposed to be the sound. The word his mother had been trying to teach him in the small hours before dawn. The word she had never been able to finish speaking before the club came down on the back of her head. The medicine word. The protection word. The wind heard the word he could not say. And the wind answered. What happened in the next 90 seconds, dear viewer, would be argued about by scholars for the next 200 years. Hassan al-Varakim, who was the only adult witness who survived that night, would later tell 3 completely different versions of the story, and each version would be more frightened than the last. The slaves chained inside the wagons would tell their own versions in whispers for the rest of their lives. But here's what we know for certain. Here is what the bones of the dead and the marks on the sand would later confirm. The storm stopped. Not slowly. Not the way storms usually die, bleeding out their fury over hours. The storm stopped all at once, as if a door had been slammed shut on the sky. The wind that had been screaming across the dunes at the speed of a galloping horse simply ceased. The sand that had been suspended in the air fell to the ground in a single great hush. And in the center of the new silence, a boy with no tongue stood up. Hassan al-Varakim took 1 step backward, and the knotted rope fell out of his hand. Aerin Stormgrave raised his head. His eyes, the chroniclers would all agree on this part, had changed. They were no longer the dull brown of a beaten slave. They were the pale silver blue of a sky just before a storm. And around him, in a slow, spiraling current that no one else could feel, but everyone could see, the air had begun to move. He looked at Hassan al-Varakim. He did not move toward him. He did not need to. The wind that had stopped a sandstorm with a single breath now lifted Hassan off his feet, gently, almost politely, and held him in the air at the level of Aerin's eyes. Hassan tried to scream. The wind took the scream out of his mouth before it could leave his throat. The chroniclers say Hassan's lips moved for almost a full minute, shaping words that no one could hear, while Aerin simply looked at him. And then Aerin let him go. Hassan dropped into the sand. He was not killed. He was not even badly hurt. He lay there, panting and weeping, while Aerin walked past him to the wagons and broke the iron locks with a movement of his hand that no one quite saw clearly. The remaining slaves came stumbling out into the new silence, and they looked at the boy who had been beaten half to death an hour ago, and they did not know whether to kneel to him or run from him. One of them did neither. A woman, perhaps 25 years old, with a freed brand on her cheek and a fresh manacle scar on her wrist. Her name was Alia ibn Marisi. She walked up to Aerin in the silence, and she looked at him for a long moment. And then she did something nobody else thought to do. She unwound the cloth from around her head, and she stepped behind him. And she very gently used the cloth to wipe the sand and the blood off the back of his neck. It was the first kind touch he had felt in 5 years. He turned around to look at her, and the wind around him slowed, and the silver blue light in his eyes faded, and he was a boy again. A boy with no tongue. A boy who did not know his own name. A boy who had just discovered that the storm of the world was, somehow, willing to listen to him. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. He pointed at himself, and then he pointed at her, and then he pointed at the wagons, and Alia understood. He was asking what to do next. He was asking because he did not know. She said in the slaver tongue, __, quote _0 __. I want to pause here, dear viewer, because this moment, this small moment in the middle of a stopped storm, is the moment the entire saga turns on. Not the wind, not the power. The moment a stranger wiped the blood off the back of a boy's neck and treated him like he was a person. Remember this. Remember Alia. Because what she does here, in this minute of silence in the middle of the sand sea, is what teaches Aerin Stormgrave the difference between revenge and justice. And by the end of this story, that difference will be the thing that decides whether 6 slave markets fall or 600. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because we are just getting started, hit subscribe to RiseArc. Every legend starts at 0, and this one is climbing fast. Drop a wind emoji in the comments if you want part 2. The Stormcaller's road is long, and the architect of the slave trade is still hiding behind the gates of the Imperial Council, and Aerin Stormgrave has not yet learned to write his own name in the sand. But he will. Stay tuned, because everything you just heard was only the prologue. The night the storm stopped, 11 slaves and 1 ruined merchant sat around a fire in the lee of a half-buried dune, and nobody spoke for almost 2 hours. It was Alia who spoke first. She had built the fire with her own hands, using broken pieces of one of Hassan's wagons, and she had pulled a sack of dried dates out of the supply hold, and she had passed them around the circle one by one. When she came to Aerin, she did not hand him the dates. She knelt in front of him, broke one of the dates open with her thumbnail, and held it up to his mouth so he could take it without using his hands. His hands, she had noticed, were still shaking. He looked at her over the open date. He did not understand why she was doing this. Nobody had fed him with their own hands since his mother. He had almost forgotten that this was a thing one human being could do for another. He took the date with his teeth. He chewed it slowly. He swallowed. He did not cry because 2 years of slavery had taught his body to stop crying, but something inside him cracked open just the same. Alia ibn Marisi, dear viewer, is a character you need to remember. She is 24 years old. She was born in a coastal city called Maricine, 3 weeks sailing west of the Sand Sea, the daughter of a midwife. She had been a free woman for the first 19 years of her life. Then her city had been sacked in a war her people had not started, and she had spent the last 5 years being sold from owner to owner, each one slightly less brutal than the last, until she had ended up in the cargo hold of a small slaver cog bound for Port Kazadvir, which was where Hassan al-Varakim had bought her 3 days before he bought Aerin. She knew exactly what the boy in front of her was. She had seen the brand on his shoulder. She had seen the scars on his back. She had seen the way he held his jaw, the very particular slackness on the left side that comes from a tongue that is no longer there. And she had seen something else in the silver-blue light that had filled his eyes in the middle of the storm that nobody else in that caravan had recognized. Because Aaliyah's mother had been a midwife, and Aaliyah's mother had told her stories. She fed him a second date. "You don't remember your real name," she said. It was not a question. "Do you?" He shook his head. "That's all right," she said. "It will come back. Names always come back. They just take their time." And here's where it gets crazy, dear viewer, because the next thing Aaliyah did was reach into the inside of her own robe, and she pulled out a small, folded square of waxed leather, no bigger than the palm of her hand, and she unfolded it in the firelight. It was a map. Not a trader's map, not a road map. The map showed a coastline none of the modern caravan masters would have recognized, and a kingdom none of them had ever heard of. And across the top of it, in a looping silver thread script that matched no language used in the Sand Sea, were 3 words. Aerin did not read the script. He could not read at all, but when his eyes fell on those 3 silver words, his hands went cold and his breath stopped in his chest, and somewhere at the back of his mind, a voice he had not heard in 5 years, his mother's voice, said the 3 words out loud. The Stormgrave Coast. He looked up at Aaliyah. His mouth opened. No sound came out, of course, but his eyes were asking a question so loud she could hear it without the words. "My mother gave me this map when I was 12, she said quietly. She told me to keep it for the boy with the silver eyes. She said one day I would meet him. She said when I did, he would not know who he was, and that it would be my job to remind him." She handed him the map. Now hold on, I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of convenient miracle that ruins a story. A random freed slave just happens to be carrying the exact map our hero needs? Believe me, dear viewer, I asked the same question. I went looking, and what I found in 3 different chronicles from 3 different cultures was that this was not a coincidence at all. Aaliyah's mother had not been a simple midwife. She had been the last living member of an order of women called the Veil-Bearers, who had spent the last 3 generations hiding the children of a destroyed bloodline in plain sight and waiting for one of those children to wake up. Aerin was not the first lost boy Aaliyah had been told to watch for. He was the 7th. The other 6 had died before she could reach them. He was the one who had survived long enough to be found. Stay tuned, because this gets bigger. The man who joined them at the fire 2 hours later was not part of Hassan's caravan. He had been traveling in the opposite direction, alone, on a single old camel, and he had walked into the camp out of the dark with both his hands raised in the air to show that he was not armed. He was old, maybe 60, maybe 70. He had a beard the color of dirty snow, and he had the squint of a man who had spent most of his life reading documents in poor light. His name was Tobias Renvale, and he was a cartographer. He had been following the storm. Cartographers, in the world Aerin had been born into, were not just map makers. The good ones, the ones with the long beards and the squinting eyes and the strange knowledge, were also historians, and the very best of them were something more dangerous than that. They were memory keepers. They remembered the things the empires had tried to forget. Tobias Renvale had spent the last 40 years of his life walking the dead borders of the old kingdoms, copying inscriptions off ruined walls, buying scraps of forbidden manuscript out of the back rooms of provincial libraries, and assembling, in the locked trunk under his bed in a small town on the northern edge of the Sand Sea, the only complete written record of the Kingdom of Aerimar that still existed anywhere in the world. Aerimar had fallen 63 years ago. The empire that had destroyed it had spent the next 63 years pretending it had never existed. Tobias had heard about the storm 2 days ago from a trader who had ridden in from the south. A storm that had stopped mid-howl in the middle of the Sand Sea. A storm that had ended on a single breath. Tobias had been waiting for a storm like that for 40 years. He had saddled his old camel within the hour, and he had ridden south alone, and he had followed the smell on the wind, the smell of stone that has not been touched by light for 1,000 years, until he had reached the fire. He sat down across the flames from Aerin. He looked at him for a long time. He looked at the brand on his shoulder, and the slackness on the left side of his jaw, and the pale, silver-blue color that was still, very faintly, swimming somewhere at the back of his irises. And then Tobias Renvale, who had not cried in front of another human being in 31 years, put his face in his hands and wept. "I was beginning to think," he said when he could speak again, "that I would die before I found you." I want you to understand, dear viewer, what was happening at this fire. 3 people. A mute slave boy who did not know his own name. A freed woman carrying a map her dead mother had handed her 12 years ago. An old cartographer who had spent 40 years of his life waiting for a storm. None of these 3 people, on their own, was anything. A boy, a widow, an old man with bad eyes. But the moment the 3 of them sat down around the same fire, the architects of the slave trade in the Southern Empire, the men sitting in marble offices in the capital, drinking sweetened wine and signing the paperwork for the next month's shipments, those men did not know it yet, but they had just lost. It was going to take a few more months for them to find out. The training began the next morning. Tobias did not call it training, he called it remembering. He said the wind did not need to be taught anything. The wind already knew what it was. Aerin was the one who had forgotten, and what Aerin needed to do was very slowly, very patiently, sit down in front of the wind and listen to it until he could hear his own voice inside it again. This is the part that nobody expected, dear viewer, because in every story like this one, in every saga of the Chosen One with the hidden power, the training is the part where the hero screams and sweats and breaks rocks with his fists and gets stronger and stronger until he can level a mountain. That is not what happened to Aerin Stormgrave. Aerin's training was the opposite of that. Aerin's training was the slow, painful, almost unbearable practice of sitting still. Tobias sat him down on the lee side of a dune at dawn on the first morning and said, quote, Aerin closed his eyes. He breathed. Within 30 seconds, the wind began to spin slowly around him, lifting little spirals of sand off the dune. Quote, said Tobias. Aerin opened his eyes. The wind kept spinning. Quote, said Tobias. It took Aerin 4 days to understand what the old man was saying. The thing he had done in the middle of the storm, the thing that had stopped the wind and lifted Hassan al-Varakim into the air, had not been an act of force. It had been an act of grief. The wind had not obeyed him. The wind had recognized him. And the only way to call the wind again, on purpose, without burning himself out, was to stop trying to be powerful and to start trying to be honest. The honest version of Aerin Stormgrave was a 16-year-old boy with no tongue who had watched his father die on the end of a spear. The wind already knew that. The wind had been waiting for him to know it too. By the end of the first week, he could call a small breeze on command. By the end of the second week, he could call a wind strong enough to lift a man off his feet. By the end of the first month, he could make the air around him so still that a candle would not flicker, or so violent that the sand would strip the paint off the side of a wagon. He still did not speak. His voice, when it came through the wind. He learned to write words in the sand by directing tiny streams of air. He learned to point Aaliyah toward water sources by feeling the moisture in the breeze. He learned, slowly, painfully, what he was. But, and here's the part the chroniclers all agree on, he never once, in the entire first year, used his power to hurt a person. Not once. Tobias had told him, on the second morning of the training, that the wind was older than empires, and the wind did not care about empires. And the day he started using the wind to kill the way the empires killed was the day the wind would stop listening to him. Aerin believed him. So when the first slave trader patrol found their little camp 3 months later and tried to take Aaliyah back, Aerin did not kill the patrol. He stripped them of their weapons with a breath, lifted them off their feet with another, and set them down on top of the highest dune for 3 miles in any direction. By the time they walked back to civilization, sunburned and humiliated, the story of the mute boy who commanded the wind had already begun to spread. The story was the problem, because the story reached, eventually, the ear of a man Aerin had almost forgotten. Hassan al-Varakim had not died that night in the storm. He had crawled back to Port Kazadvir on foot, eating sand for 9 days, and he had arrived at the gates of the city looking like a corpse that had not yet been informed of its own death. He had lost his caravan, his slaves, his wagons, and most of his sanity. He had also lost something he valued more than any of those things, which was his place in the Slavers Guild. A merchant who lost his entire shipment to a stripped slave boy was not a merchant the guild wanted to do business with anymore. They turned him away at the door of the guild house. They confiscated his trader's seal. They told him he was no one. He went home and sat in the dark for 2 months. And then, on a hot afternoon, in the month the desert people call the burning moon, he stood up, washed his face, put on his last clean robe, and walked across the city to the headquarters of the southern branch of the Imperial Intelligence Service. He paid a clerk 3 silver coins to put his name on the list of people who wanted to make a deposition. He waited 6 hours. Then he was shown into a small, windowless room where a thin man with a scribe's stylus and very flat eyes sat behind a wooden table, and the thin man asked him what he wanted to deposit. Hassan al-Varakim said, "I know where the Stormcaller is." The thin man's stylus stopped moving. He looked up. He looked at Hassan for a long time, the way a snake looks at a rat it has not yet decided whether to swallow. And then, very quietly, the thin man closed his ledger, stood up, walked out of the room, and came back 4 minutes later with a man Hassan had never seen before. This man was younger, maybe 30. He was dressed in plain black, and he had a small silver pin in the shape of a closed eye on the collar of his coat. The pin was the only marker, but Hassan had been a trader long enough to recognize the marker. The closed eye was the sigil of the office of the Chancellor of the Imperial Council. Hassan al-Varakim, a ruined slaver from a backwater port, had just spoken a word that was important enough to bring down a representative of the most powerful man in the Empire. The man in black sat down across from him. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. Quote 14, quote, he said. Quote 15, quote. Hassan talked for 3 hours. He talked about the storm. He talked about the boy who had stopped the storm with a breath. He talked about the woman with the cloth and the old man with the bad eyes who had joined them at the fire. He talked about the direction the camp had gone in the morning and the rumors he had heard since, and the descriptions of the patrols who had been stripped of their weapons. He talked until his voice gave out, and the man in black wrote down everything he said in a small black book. And when Hassan was done, the man in black closed the book and stood up and put a fat purse of imperial gold on the table. Quote 16, quote, he said. Quote 17, quote. Hassan nodded. The man in black did not nod back. He walked out of the room and out of the building, and within 4 hours, a courier was riding north toward the capital with a sealed letter in his saddlebag, and within a week, the letter was on the desk of a man named Vorin Salkareth, the Chancellor of the Imperial Council, and within a month, a bounty had been placed on the head of the mute boy who commanded the wind. The bounty was set at 50,000 gold imperials. It was the largest bounty ever placed on a single human being in the recorded history of the Empire. It was also, in a way the Chancellor did not yet realize, the first mistake of his career. Because the moment the bounty was posted, every mercenary, bounty hunter, slave catcher, and freelance murderer within 1,000 miles of the Sand Sea began to ask the same question. Who was this boy? What had he done? And why was the second most powerful man in the world willing to pay a king's ransom to have him killed? The story that had been spreading through the desert as a whisper became, almost overnight, a roar. And the boy at the center of the story, dear viewer, was about to lose the second father he had ever had. It was a market day in a small caravan town called Aerin Stormgrave, 3 weeks' walk inland from where the storm had stopped. Aerin and Aaliyah and Tobias had been moving constantly for the last 6 months, never sleeping in the same town twice, never staying anywhere long enough to be photographed by memory. Tobias had insisted on this. Tobias had said that the day they stayed still was the day they died. But Tobias was 68 years old, and his old camel had finally collapsed 2 days outside of Aerin Stormgrave, and Tobias needed to buy a new mount, and there was no caravan master between here and the next town who would sell to a man without papers. So they had come into Aerin Stormgrave to buy a camel. They had planned to be in the town for 1 afternoon. They were in the town for 47 minutes before the bounty hunters found them. There were 6 of them. They had been waiting in Aerin Stormgrave for a week. On a tip from an informant who had seen the trio pass through a smaller village to the north. They came at the trio in the central market, in broad daylight, with crossbows already drawn. Aerin saw them first. He felt the wrongness in the air before he saw the men, and he turned to shout a warning to Tobias, which of course came out as nothing, just a movement of his open mouth, and Tobias did not look up in time. The first bolt took Tobias Renvale in the throat. He went down without a sound. His hands fluttered up to his neck, as if he were trying to brush away an insect, and then his eyes found Aerin's eyes across the market square, and Tobias did something Aerin would remember for the rest of his life. He smiled, a small, almost satisfied smile. As if to say, "It's all right. I lived long enough. I lived long enough to find you. The rest is yours." And then he died. What happened next, dear viewer, was the second time the wind around Aerin Stormgrave changed. The first time, in the middle of the storm, the wind had been grief. The wind had been a boy who could not scream, finding a sound somewhere outside himself. That had been a small, contained, almost gentle thing. This time was different. This time was rage. The chroniclers of Aerin Stormgrave, and Aerin Stormgrave has chroniclers because every market town in the Sand Sea keeps a list of the strange things that happen in it, wrote in their ledgers that on the 17th day of the burning moon, a sudden, inexplicable storm arose in the central market of the town and lasted approximately 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, no human being could see more than an arm's length in front of their own face. The wind in the market square exceeded any wind ever recorded in the town's history. When the storm cleared, 6 bounty hunters were found dead. Their bodies were not marked. They had no wounds. They had simply, the town's physician would later record, stopped breathing, as if the air around them had decided it was no longer interested in entering their lungs. In the center of the market, kneeling next to the body of the old cartographer, was a 16-year-old boy with silver hair and silver eyes, and a freed slave woman with her arms wrapped around his shoulders. And the town's chroniclers wrote that the boy was making no sound at all, but that everyone in the market square could hear him weeping, the way you hear the wind weep at night against the shutters of a closed house. The bounty was doubled the next morning, 100,000 gold imperials. The largest bounty in the history of the Empire became, within 12 hours, twice the largest bounty in the history of the Empire. Aerin Stormgrave was now, officially, the most wanted man in the world. And he was also, for the first time since the night his mother had died, absolutely, undeniably, terrifyingly awake. Stay with me, dear viewer. We are about to enter the part of the saga where the boy becomes the storm, where 6 slave markets fall in 4 months, where the road from a forgotten coastal village leads finally to the marble gates of the Imperial Council and the man who has been signing the paperwork on every slave shipment in the Southern Empire for the last 41 years. His name is Wyl Stormgrave. He is 63 years old. He has never been bested in a political negotiation. He has never lost a war he has personally directed. And he is about to learn, the hard way, that the boy whose mother he ordered killed 16 years ago did not die in the raid the way his agents had reported. The boy survived. The boy is coming. And if you want to see how that ends, and trust me, dear viewer, you do, hit subscribe to RiseArc. Every legend starts at 0. This one is climbing fast. Drop a wind emoji if you want part 3. We've still got the fall of 6 markets to walk through. We've still got the return to Port Khazadvir. We've still got the moment Aerin Stormgrave writes his real name in the sand for the first time in his life. And we've still got the Iron Mask waiting in the shadows of the Vale Coram Citadel. But all of that, all of it, starts with one question asked by an old cartographer at a fire in the middle of the Sand Sea 6 months before he died. The question was this: __quote _18__. And the boy, who had no tongue, had pointed at the brand on his shoulder, and then he had pointed at the horizon to the south, and then he had pointed at his own heart. Which Tobias Renvale, who had spent 40 years learning the language of silence, understood perfectly. Burn the markets, free the chained, then find the man who started it. That, dear viewer, is exactly what is going to happen next. 6 markets, dear viewer. 6 slave markets in 4 months. That is what the chroniclers wrote down. That is what the Imperial records, declassified almost a century later, would eventually confirm. But the chroniclers got one thing wrong, and the Imperial records got it wrong for the same reason. They both assumed that Aerin Stormgrave was building an army. He was not. He was building a road. Let me show you what I mean. The first market to fall was Sarakash. Sarakash was not the largest of the 6, but it was the most cruel. It specialized in what the slavers called, quote, 19, children under the age of 10, sold in covered cages so the buyers did not have to look at their faces until the contract was signed. Sarakash had been operating, more or less openly, for 46 years. The Imperial Council took a quiet 7% of every transaction, which was the reason Sarakash had never been investigated, never been raided, never been so much as fined. Aerin came to Sarakash on foot, in a sandstorm of his own making, 4 months after Tobias Renvale died. He did not come alone. He came with Aaliyah, who walked at his right shoulder, and with 2 new companions Aaliyah had collected along the way. The first new companion was a man named Kael Drennick. Kael was 31 years old, a former gladiator from the inland arena of Boric Tool. He had killed 42 men in the pit before he had refused to kill the 43rd, who had been a friend of his from boyhood. His punishment had been to be sold into the slave galleys for life. Aaliyah had found him on a wrecked galley ship beached half a day's walk from where they were camped, the only survivor, still chained to his rowing bench, drinking rainwater out of a broken jug. He had 2 scars across his face, no front teeth on the left side, and the most peaceful eyes Aerin had ever seen on a man who knew how to kill. The second new companion was a girl. She was 12. Her name was Sira Halven. Aaliyah had bought her, yes, dear viewer, bought her, with the last of Tobias's coins, because there had been no other way to get her out, from a small market 2 weeks south of Eril Sahad. The slaver had been selling her cheap because she was, in his words, quote 20 quote. She did not speak. She did not eat unless she was forced to. She stared at walls for hours at a time. The slaver said she was simple. Aaliyah, who had watched her own mother work as a midwife for 19 years, and who knew the difference between a broken mind and a mind that had simply gone very far inside itself, paid the slaver and took her by the hand and walked her out of the market without looking back. On the 3rd night they had Sira, in a camp under a starless sky. Sira had crawled into Aerin's lap, looked up at him, and said the first words she had spoken in 2 years. "They will use the western gate," she had said, "not the southern one. The captain is sick. The southern guard will be doubled. The western will be thinned." Aerin had stared down at her. Aaliyah, from across the fire, had stared too. "What are you talking about, little one?" Aaliyah had asked, very gently. Sira had looked confused, as if surprised they did not already know. "Sarakash," she had said. "When you go there, the western gate." Now hold on, dear viewer. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like another convenient miracle. A 12-year-old prophetess just happens to fall into the protagonist's lap right before the first major operation? Believe me, I dug into this one too. And what I found, in the old medical text of the Veil-Bearers, the same order Aaliyah's mother had belonged to, was a condition the Veil-Bearers had called the listening sleep. Children born under certain stars, in certain bloodlines, who had been exposed to extreme trauma very young, sometimes developed an unusual relationship with what the Veilbearers called the thin time. They heard things 3 days, sometimes 7 days, sometimes a month before those things happened. The Veilbearers had documented 43 such children over 300 years. Sira Halvin was, as far as we can tell, the 44th. She was going to be very, very useful. The fall of Sarakash took 11 minutes. It happened at dawn. Aerin walked up to the western gate, exactly as Sira had told him to, with Kael Drenok at his left shoulder and Aaliyah and Sira waiting in a date grove half a mile away. There were 6 guards at the western gate. Sira had said the captain was sick. Sira had been correct. The 6 guards were tired, hungover, and short one of their usual reliefs. They saw the boy and the man approaching across the open sand, and they laughed, because a boy and a man on foot were not a threat. They were a curiosity. The lead guard called out something dismissive and reached for his crossbow. He did not get to use it. The crossbow did not fire. The string of the crossbow, in fact, was the first thing in Sarakash to learn that the wind had arrived. Every crossbow string in the western gatehouse snapped at the same instant with a sound like 6 small whips cracking in sequence. The guards looked down at their useless weapons. They looked up at the boy. They did not see Aerin's face change. Nobody ever did. The thing the wind did when Aerin called it on purpose was so subtle that the chroniclers who interviewed survivors years later could never get a consistent description. Some said his eyes glowed. Some said his hair lifted off his scalp. Some said nothing at all changed about him, except that the air around him became, very suddenly, the air of a person you did not want to be standing next to. The 6 guards at the western gate were not killed. Aerin had a rule about this now. He had had a rule since the bounty hunters in Ir al-Sahad. The rule was, he killed nobody he did not have to kill. Tobias had taught him that the wind was older than empires, and the wind did not care about empires, and the day Aerin started killing the way the empires killed was the day the wind would stop listening. So the 6 guards at the western gate were not killed. They were lifted, one at a time, off their feet, and they were carried by an invisible hand that none of them could see, over the wall and out into the open desert, where they were set down very gently in a circle around a single date palm a quarter mile from the city. None of them was hurt. All of them were unconscious by the time their feet touched the sand. They woke up 4 hours later, in the heat of midday, with no memory of who had taken them or how. By that time, Sarakash had no slaves left. This is the part nobody expected, dear viewer, because in every other story like this, the liberation of a slave market is a bloodbath. Walls fall, slavers die, buildings burn. The hero stands in the smoke at the end with his sword dripping and his hair blowing dramatically in the wind. That was not what happened in Sarakash. What happened in Sarakash was that Aerin Stormgrave walked through the market, opened every cage with a touch, called the wind around each freed slave like a soft, warm blanket, and walked them, 347 of them, including 91 children, out the western gate in absolute silence. The slavers in the market were not killed. The slavers in the market were not even injured. The slavers in the market were, every single one of them, standing exactly where they had been standing 5 minutes earlier, completely unable to move, completely unable to speak, while the wind held them gently in place, and the 347 people they had been planning to sell that morning walked past them out of their lives forever. When the wind released the slavers 2 hours later, the market was empty. The cages were empty. The auction blocks were empty. The slavers themselves were not harmed in any way, but every single one of them, the chroniclers of Sarakash would later record, sat down on the wooden steps of his own auction block and wept like a child for almost an hour. When asked, days later, what had happened to them while the wind was holding them, none of them would say. The few who tried would begin to speak, would get partway through the first sentence, and would then put their faces in their hands and refuse to continue. Whatever Aerin Stormgrave had whispered to each of them while their bodies could not move, they took the memory of it to their graves. The story of Sarakash reached the capital within 9 days. The Chancellor doubled the bounty again, 200,000 gold Imperials. He also, for the first time, ordered a full company of the Imperial Iron Guard to march south. The Iron Guard was the personal military arm of the Imperial Council. It did not march for ordinary problems. The last time the Iron Guard had marched, 16 years ago, had been to destroy a small coastal village called Hollowtide, where the Empire's intelligence had located the last surviving heir of a bloodline the Council had spent a generation erasing. The order to march south was signed personally in red ink by Chancellor Vorin Salkareth. It was the second mistake of his career. The second market to fall was Dun to Hear. The third was Eltheria. The fourth was Vol Kareth. Each one fell faster than the one before, because each one had received more warning than the one before, and each warning, for reasons the slavers could not understand, made things worse rather than better. Dun to Hear tripled its guards. Aerin made the guards walk out of the city on their own legs, with no memory of having been told to do so. Eltheria locked every slave in a single fortified warehouse with iron-bound doors. Aerin opened the doors with a breath. Vol Kareth burned its own market down preemptively in a panic before he could arrive, killing 23 slavers and almost 100 slaves in the fire. That one Aerin did not forgive. The slavers of Vol Kareth were the only ones in the entire campaign that the wind did, in fact, hurt. Not kill, dear viewer, hurt. There is a difference, and Aerin still remembered the difference. But after Vol Kareth, the slavers of the Southern Empire stopped trying to outsmart him. They started running. The story spread. The bounty grew. The Iron Guard moved south. And the man at the front of the strange, small parade that was now several thousand freed slaves and a handful of new fighters who had joined the cause. Aerin Stormgrave, 16 years old, still without a tongue, still without a name he remembered, was about to learn the most important thing about himself. It happened in the ruins of Aerimar. Tobias Renvale had marked the place on his map. Aaliyah had been carrying the map for 6 months. They had been moving in roughly the right direction the whole time, but they had not actually intended to go there until the night Sira sat up in the middle of a camp 3 days after the fall of Vol Kareth and said, "We have to go to the old city. Mother is waiting." Aaliyah had asked her, very carefully, which mother she meant. Sira had said, "His, not mine, his." The ruins of Aerimar lay in a high, cold valley in the spine of the mountains that divided the Sand Sea from the northern grasslands. The Empire had destroyed the city 63 years ago. The Empire had then, very deliberately, removed the city from every map, salted the fields around it, and rerouted the only road that had once led to it so that no caravan would ever pass within a day's ride of the ruins again. The Empire had wanted Aerimar forgotten. The Empire had succeeded for 63 years. Tobias Renvale had been one of 9 living human beings, by his own count, who had still known where the ruins were. Sira led them straight to them. They came over a high pass at sunset on the 7th day of the climb, and they looked down into the valley, and Aerin stopped walking. The valley was beautiful. The Empire had not been able to take that away. The valley was green and gold in the late light, with a small, clear river running through the middle of it, and at the heart of the valley, in the bend of the river, lay the broken stones of what had once been a city of perhaps 50,000 people. The walls were down. The towers were down. The roofs were gone. But the foundations were still there, and the streets were still there, and a careful observer, which Aerin was now, after months of Tobias's patient teaching, could still see the shape of the city the way it had been. The market square, the temple district, the wide main avenue that had led dead straight from the river gate to the steps of what had once been the royal palace. Aerin had never been to this place in his life. He had been born 60 miles away, on the coast at Hollowtide, 3 years before his mother had fled here with him as an infant. He had no conscious memory of Aerimar at all, but he knew the streets. He stood on the pass at sunset, and he looked down at the broken city, and he knew the streets. He knew which curve of the river hid the place his mother had played as a child. He knew which broken tower had once held the bell that had rung for his grandmother's wedding. He knew, without being told, that the third stone on the eastern side of the palace steps had a crack in it shaped like a running horse, because his grandfather had pointed out the crack to his mother when she was 4 years old, and his mother had pointed it out to him in her sleep, in the lullabies she had sung over his cradle in Hollowtide before the raiders had come. Aerin Stormgrave sat down on the pass, and he wept without a sound, the way he had wept once before in the market of Ir-al-Sahad. Aaliyah sat down beside him and put her arms around him and did not try to say anything, because there was nothing to say. Chaol stood behind them with his hand on the hilt of his sword, looking out across the valley with the still face of a man who had seen too many ruins to be surprised by another one. And Sira, the 12-year-old prophetess, walked past all three of them down the pass into the valley without looking back. Quote 30, she called over her shoulder. Quote 31. What they found in the ruins of Aramar, dear viewer, is the part of this story that the Empire spent 63 years trying to make sure nobody would ever find. In the cellar beneath the broken palace, under a stone slab that Chaol had to lever up with a length of iron pipe, was a chamber. The chamber was small. The chamber was dry. The chamber had been sealed 63 years ago by a woman who had known on the morning she sealed it that she would not live to see it opened. The chamber contained 3 things. The first thing was a sword, not a large sword, a curved blade slightly shorter than a man's forearm, with a hilt wrapped in pale leather and a pommel shaped like a curl of wind. The blade had been forged 800 years ago by smiths whose names were no longer remembered for the founding king of Aramar. The blade had a name. The name was carved in the old script along the spine of the blade in letters so fine they could only be read when the blade caught the light at exactly the right angle. The name was Verwind. It meant in the old tongue, the wind that remembers. The second thing was a small wooden box. Inside the box was a coil of pale silver hair, neatly braided, tied at both ends with a strip of red silk. There was also a folded square of parchment. The parchment, when unfolded, contained a single sentence written in a careful woman's hand. The sentence was, "For my son, when he comes home." The third thing in the chamber was a name. The name was carved into the wall above the slab, in the same fine old script as the writing on the sword. The carver had taken her time. The carver had wanted, more than anything in the world, for the name to be readable. When the boy she had hidden finally walked into this chamber and looked up, the name was Aerin Stormgrave, 7th of his line, Stormcaller, King of Aramar in exile. Aerin Stormgrave stood in the cellar of his ancestor's broken palace and read his own name for the first time in 14 years. He did not, dear viewer, react the way the stories say a king is supposed to react. He did not stand straighter. He did not lift his chin. He did not draw the sword from the slab and hold it up to the lantern light and let the wind whip around him in a moment of triumphant destiny. None of that happened. What happened was that Aerin Stormgrave, who had been a slave for 5 years and a mute for 2, sank down onto his knees on the dusty floor of the cellar and put his hands flat on the cold stone and closed his eyes and stayed there, completely still, for almost an hour. Aaliyah did not interrupt him. Chaol did not interrupt him. Sira sat down in a corner of the chamber with her arms around her knees and watched him with the calm, patient gaze of a child who had known, all along, that this was where he had been going. When he finally opened his eyes, he reached for the sword. He did not draw it. He did not lift it above his head. He simply put one hand on the hilt, and he closed his fingers around the leather wrapping, and he held the sword the way a person holds the hand of a relative he has not seen since childhood. Then he reached for the wooden box. He opened it. He took out the braid of silver hair. He held it against his cheek for a long moment, and his eyes closed again, and the wind in the chamber, which had been still because Aerin had been still, moved very gently around him, the way a hand might move through a child's hair to soothe him to sleep. Aaliyah, who had been holding her breath, finally spoke. __quote _32 __, she asked. Aerin did not answer. He could not answer. But he opened his eyes and he looked at her, and Aaliyah saw in his face the answer she had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. The boy who had been bought for the price of 2 goats was gone. Not dead, just gone. In his place was a young man who finally knew, all the way down to the marrow of his bones, what he was for. He stood up, he sheathed the sword. He put the braid back in the box and the box inside his shirt against his heart. He walked past Sira, past Kale, past Aaliyah, and up the stairs out of the chamber, and out of the broken palace, and out into the sunset valley where the wind was already rising to meet him. When he reached the river at the bottom of the valley, he stopped. He knelt on the bank. He picked up a single, smooth stone from the riverbed. He used the stone to write a word in the sand at the water's edge. Just one word. The word he had not been able to say in 5 years, because his mother had been clubbed to death before she could finish saying it, and because 2 years later, a man had taken the tongue that might have said it later. The word was Aerin. He looked up at Aaliyah, who had followed him down to the river. He pointed at the word in the sand. He pointed at himself. Aerin, Aaliyah said softly. Your name is Aerin. He nodded. He smiled. It was the first smile he had worn in 5 years. And dear viewer, if you had been there to see it, you would have understood why 3,000 freed slaves and a former gladiator and a 12-year-old prophetess were about to follow him into a war against the most powerful man in the empire. Then he turned. He looked south, back the way they had come, toward the sand sea and the port city of Khazad-vir, where a fat, ruined merchant named Hassan al-Varakim had once paid 12 copper coins for him, and where the largest slave market in the southern empire still stood, still operating, still putting children in cages every morning. He had been freeing the small markets first, because the small markets were the practice. He had been building the road. The road led to Port Khazad-vir. The road led, after that, to the marble gates of the Imperial Council and the man behind them. But first, dear viewer, he had to go home. And here's where it gets crazy, because home, Port Khazad-vir, the place that had branded him, sold him, silenced him, was now defended by the full company of the Imperial Iron Guard, 2,000 professional soldiers, the elite of the Empire's military, sent personally by Chancellor Vorin Salkareth, with orders to bring back the head of the Stormcaller in a salted box. Aerin Stormgrave was 16 years old. He had 4 companions, 3,000 untrained freed slaves, and a sword that had not been drawn in 63 years. He had no army. He had no plan. He had no idea, yet, how he was going to walk into a fortified port city, defended by the best soldiers in the Empire, and walk back out with everyone in the slave market alive behind him. But the wind, dear viewer, the wind had been waiting 800 years for this, and the wind had a plan of its own. Stay tuned, because in the next part of this saga, we walk into Port Khazad-vir. We watch a 16-year-old mute king meet 2,000 professional soldiers in open battle for the first time in his life. We watch what happens when Hassan al-Varakim, the man who paid 12 copper coins for him, hears in the distance the sound of a wind he last heard in the middle of the sand sea. We watch the moment Aerin Stormgrave decides, and he does decide, dear viewer. It is a decision, and the decision will cost him, whether the rule he has held to for 4 months, the rule against killing, still applies when the people across the field from him are wearing the colors of the man who ordered his mother's death. Hit subscribe to RiseArc. Every legend starts at 0. This one is climbing fast. Drop a wind emoji in the comments if you want part 4. The road to the Imperial Council runs through the auction block where this whole story began, and Aerin Stormgrave is finally, after 5 years, walking back to the place that tried to erase him. He is not the same boy who left, and the wind, dear viewer, is no longer a whisper. The man behind all of it, dear viewer, was sitting at a marble desk on the 14th floor of the Imperial Council building on the morning Aerin Stormgrave began his march back to Port Kazadvir. His name was Wyl Stormgrave. He was 63 years old. He had been Chancellor of the Imperial Council for 41 years, which was longer than 3 of the last 4 emperors had reigned. He had outlived 2 assassination attempts, 1 civil war, and 7 chancellors who had tried to replace him. He drank lemon water in the morning and watered wine at night. He had 3 sons who did not know his real business and 1 daughter who did. He had killed more people with the stroke of a pen than any general in the Empire had ever killed with a sword. The reason he had ordered the destruction of Hollowtide 16 years ago, dear viewer, was simple. Wyl Stormgrave had not always been a chancellor. Wyl Stormgrave had once been a young, ambitious, second-rank advisor in the court of the Kingdom of Aerin. 63 years ago, before Aerin fell. And the way Aerin had fallen, the very specific way, the inside-out way, the way that involved a poisoned wine cup at a royal wedding and a forged letter to a foreign general and a gate left unlocked on a moonless night, had been arranged by a young, ambitious, second-rank advisor named Wyl Stormgrave, who had then walked out of the burning city with a chest of gold and a letter of introduction to the Empire that had paid him to do it. He had risen quickly inside the Empire after that. The Empire valued men who could solve problems quietly. Wyl Stormgrave had solved a great many problems over the next 63 years. He had also, over those same 63 years, been quietly hunting down and erasing the last surviving members of the Aerin royal line, because Wyl Stormgrave was the kind of man who understood that a betrayal is not finished until the last witness is in the ground. Wyl Stormgrave, Aerin's mother, had been the last surviving princess of Aerin. She had escaped the fall of the city as an infant, hidden in a fish barrel by a servant girl who had loved her. She had grown up in a coastal village called Hollowtide under a false name. She had married a fisherman named Kaelin. She had given birth to a son she had named Aerin after her dead father, and she had taught the boy, in the small hours before dawn, the old word her own mother had taught her, the word the Stormcallers of Aerin had used for 800 years to call the wind. Wyl Stormgrave had located her when Aerin was 11 years old. He had sent the black-sailed ships. He had thought, when the ships came back with a report of a burned village and no survivors, that he was finally finished with the bloodline of Aerin. He was wrong, dear viewer. He was very, very wrong. And on the morning Aerin began his march back to Port Kazadvir, an Imperial courier walked into Stormgrave's office on the 14th floor of the council building and put a sealed dispatch on the marble desk and stood at attention. The dispatch contained 4 words. The Stormcaller is Aerin. Wyl Stormgrave read the 4 words. He read them again. Then he stood up, walked to the tall window of his office, looked out across the white stone city of the Imperial capital, and was silent for almost 10 minutes. His daughter, who had been working at a smaller desk in the corner of the same office, would later tell the historians that in those 10 minutes, she watched her father age in a way she had never seen anyone age before. Not the slow aging of years, the fast aging of a man who has just realized that a debt he thought he had paid 63 years ago has been compounding interest in the dark the entire time. When he finally turned away from the window, his voice was perfectly calm. Quote 35, he said. Quote 36. His daughter, her name was Izel, dear viewer. Remember it, she will matter later. Looked up from her desk. Quote 37. Quote, she said carefully. Quote 38. Quote 39. Quote, said Wyl Stormgrave. Quote 40. Quote 41. Quote 42. Quote 43. Quote, said Wyl Stormgrave. Quote 44. Quote, Izel did not move. Her father had used the word stupid to describe the Emperor in his own office, in front of his own daughter, for the first time in his life. She understood in that moment that something had broken in him that would not be fixed. Quote _45 __, she said. But she did not draft the order that afternoon. She drafted a different letter in her own hand on a different piece of paper, and she sealed it with a wax stamp that had not been used in 3 generations. A stamp her father did not know she possessed, and she gave the letter to a courier who did not work for the council, with instructions to ride south as fast as a horse could carry him. The letter was addressed to a young man whose name she had never written before, whose name, in fact, she had only learned that morning from the same dispatch her father had read. The letter began, "To Aerin Stormgrave, last of his line, from a friend you do not know you have." This is the part nobody expected, dear viewer, because Wyl Stormgrave had a secret of her own, and the secret was this. She had known, since she was 14 years old, what her father really was. She had found the old documents. She had read the original letters. She had understood, in a way her brothers never would, that the marble desk on the 14th floor of the council building was sitting on a foundation of bones, and that some of those bones belonged to people who had once been the rightful rulers of a kingdom her father had destroyed. She had spent the 9 years since then waiting, very quietly, for a chance to do something about it. The chance had just arrived. Stay tuned, because the war that is about to happen at Port Khazad-Vir is not just a battle between a 16-year-old Stormcaller and the most powerful man in the Empire. It is a battle in which there is a third player, hidden on a board nobody knows she is on. And the third player has just made her first move. The march of the freed slaves to Port Khazad-Vir took 11 days. By the end of it, the column that walked across the last ridge of dunes and looked down at the white stone walls of the port city was no longer the 3,000 exhausted ex-prisoners that had left the ruins of Aramar. It had grown. Every village they had passed through had emptied behind them. Every caravan stop had spilled out a handful of people who had heard the story and decided that they would rather die walking with the Stormcaller than live one more year sweeping the floors of the man they were sweeping for. The column that crested the last ridge was 11,000 strong. Most of them had no weapons. About 400 had bows. Maybe 60 had swords. Almost none of them had ever fought in a real battle. Across the plain in front of the city walls, drawn up in the perfect rectangular formations the Imperial Iron Guard had been famous for since the founding of the Empire, were 2,000 professional soldiers in polished iron plate. They had been waiting 6 days. They were rested. They were fed. They had 3 siege engines, 40 cavalry, and a commander named General Tarkus Vondel, who had personally won 11 battles in 9 campaigns and had never lost one. And behind the rectangular formations of the Iron Guard, just visible at the back of the plain, having arrived in the last 48 hours by forced march from the capital, was a second army. This one wore black instead of iron gray. This one was twice as large. This one carried the personal banner of Chancellor Vorin Salkareth himself, who sat on a black horse at the head of the formation, watching the ridgeline through a brass spyglass with the calm expression of a man who had finally cornered a debt he had been chasing for 63 years. Aerin Stormgrave stood on the ridge and looked down at the field. Aaliyah stood at his right shoulder. Kael Drenok stood at his left, with his hand on the hilt of his old gladiator's sword. Sira Halvin sat on a rock just behind them, her arms around her knees, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently as she counted something only she could see. Aerin looked at Aaliyah. He pointed at the field. He raised his eyebrows. The gesture meant, "What do you see?" Aaliyah looked at the field for a long time before she answered. "I see," she said quietly, "the same kind of men who killed your father, wearing different colors, standing in front of the same kind of city that sold you for the price of 2 goats. I see 12,000 soldiers between us and 3,000 people in cages who are going to be on a ship to the inland markets by sunset tomorrow if we do not get to them first." She paused. "And I see," she said, "that you have a choice to make in the next 10 minutes. And it is the choice Tobias warned you about." Aerin closed his eyes. He had been thinking about this choice for 11 days. The wind, Tobias had said, was older than empires. The wind did not care about empires. The day Aerin started killing the way the empires killed was the day the wind would stop listening to him. He had held to that rule for 4 months and 6 markets. He had held to it because Tobias had told him to hold to it, and because his mother, in the small hours before dawn, had taught him a word she had called medicine, not weapon. But the men on the field below were not the small market guards of Sarakash and Dun Tahir. The men on the field below were the elite of an empire that had ordered the burning of his village, the murder of his father, the silencing of his mother, the breaking of his own life into pieces small enough to fit into a slaver's ledger. The man on the black horse at the back of the field was the man who had given every one of those orders, and the 11,000 people standing behind Aerin on the ridge had walked across the desert for 11 days because they believed. And, dear viewer, this is the heaviest weight a 16-year-old can carry, so let us name it clearly. They believed that he could do what nobody else in the world could do, which was beat that man. Aerin opened his eyes. He turned to Aaliyah. He shook his head. It was a small gesture. It took half a second. Aaliyah, who had been holding her breath, let it out very slowly, because what Aerin had just told her, in the only language he had, was, "I will not kill them. Not even today. Not even him." She nodded. "Quote 50, quote," she said. "Quote 51, quote." Aerin turned and looked at Sira. Sira opened her eyes. "Quote 52, quote," she said. "Quote 53, quote." I want to pause here, dear viewer, because what Sira had just said requires some context, and the context is the most beautiful and the most dangerous piece of geography in the entire empire. 2 miles south of Port Khazad-Vir, running in a long crescent across the plain between the city and the desert, stood the wall of the salt columns. The wall was not built by human hands. It was a natural formation, the petrified remains of an ancient inland sea, a half-mile-long line of vertical white salt pillars, some of them 80 feet tall, that had been standing on that plain for so long that the city had been built specifically to use them as a natural defensive barrier on the southern approach. The Iron Guard in Salkareth's 2nd Legion had drawn up their formations behind the wall, using the salt columns as a screen against the freed slave columns' advance. It was a textbook defensive position. The salt columns were too tall to climb, too dense to march through, too brittle to use as cover for a charge. But the salt columns, dear viewer, were also made of salt. And salt, when struck at exactly the right angle by exactly the right kind of wind, behaves in a way that nobody, not General Tarkus Vondel, not Chancellor Vorin Salkareth, not any military engineer in the entire history of the Empire, had ever bothered to study. Sira had been listening for the salt columns for 3 days. Aerin nodded once. He drew Verwind from the sheath at his hip, for the first time since he had taken it out of the chamber under the broken palace, and the curved blade caught the morning light, and the wind on the ridge, which had been calm, began, very softly, to move. He looked down the line of his 11,000. He could not shout to them, he had no tongue. But Kael Drenok, who had been a gladiator and had learned to project his voice across an arena of 10,000 drunken spectators, stepped forward and lifted his old sword and shouted in the language of the Southern Empire so that every person on the ridge could hear him. Kael shouted. 11,000 people on the ridge stood very still. Some of them began to cry. Most of them did not understand what Kael had said about the wall falling. None of them was about to ask. On the field below, General Tarkus Vondel raised his arm to give the order to advance the cavalry. He had been ordered by Salkareth personally to take the ridge in the first hour of the battle. He never gave the order, because at that exact moment, dear viewer, Aerin Stormgrave raised Verwind above his head, and he closed his eyes, and he opened his mouth. And for the first time in 7 years, he tried with everything he had, to say a word. No sound came out. Of course no sound came out. The tongue was gone. But the wind heard the word anyway. It was the word his mother had been trying to finish on the night the raiders came. The word she had taught him in the small hours before dawn. The medicine word. The protection word. The Stormcaller word. And here's where it gets crazy, dear viewer. Because the wind that answered him was not the wind that had stopped the sandstorm in the Sand Sea, and it was not the wind that had stripped the bounty hunters at Ir el-Sahad, and it was not the wind that had carried 6 slave markets worth of prisoners to safety in absolute silence. The wind that answered him now was a wind that had not blown across that plain in 800 years. It was the wind the founding king of Aerimar had called, in the old time, to part the seas around his fleet. It was a wind that knew the specific resonant frequency of a vertical pillar of crystallized ancient ocean salt, because 800 years ago, a Stormcaller king had built a kingdom on the edge of an inland sea and had learned every song the salt could sing. The wall of the salt columns began, all at once, to hum. The Imperial soldiers behind the wall heard the humming first. It was a low, resonant, almost beautiful sound. And at the beginning, they thought it was a kind of horn the freed slaves were blowing. Then the humming became louder, and the soldiers nearest the columns began to feel the air vibrating in their breastplates. And a few of the older soldiers, the ones who had been around long enough to know that beautiful sounds in the middle of a battle are almost always bad news, began, very quietly, to take a step backward. The humming became a chord. The chord became a scream. And every salt column in the half-mile crescent of the wall, simultaneously, in a single great hush of motion that nobody on the field would ever forget for the rest of their lives, crumbled. They did not fall. They did not topple. They turned, in the space of 2 heartbeats, into a fine, white powder that rose into the air in a single enormous cloud and was then carried by the wind Aerin Stormgrave was holding above his head, straight out across the plain and directly into the faces of the entire combined formation of the Iron Guard and the 2nd Legion. 12,000 soldiers were, in one moment, completely blind. Not killed, dear viewer, not even wounded. Salt powder in the eyes is excruciating, but it is not lethal and it is not permanent. The soldiers on the field were going to be fine in 3 hours. They were going to be able to see again by sunset. They were going to walk home, eventually, and tell the story of the day a 16-year-old boy made the wall in front of them disappear into the air without lifting a finger. But for the next 3 hours, they could not see. They could not aim. They could not advance. They could not, dear viewer, even find each other in the white cloud. The formation that General Tarkus Vondel had spent 6 days perfecting dissolved into a milling, choking, terrified mass of men trying to wipe their eyes and not stab the man next to them by accident. And 11,000 freed slaves walked off the ridge, past the blinded armies, into Port Khazad-Vir through the open south gate, and to the slave market in the center of the city, where 3,041 people in cages were waiting for the ship that was supposed to take them inland the next morning. Aerin Stormgrave walked through the auction square of Port Khazad-Vir, dear viewer, on the same wooden boards where, 5 years earlier, he had stood in a row of 7 naked children with a brand on his shoulder and a price of 12 copper coins on his head. He did not stop at the auction block. He did not need to. He walked past it to the iron-barred holding pens behind it, and he opened them one by one with a touch. He saw Hassan al-Verakim, by the way. The fat merchant had been hiding in the back of the market behind a stack of empty cages, peering out, expecting to see a massacre. He saw instead a 16-year-old boy with silver hair and a curved sword, and 3,000 people walking out of the cages behind him with their hands free for the first time in months or years, or in some cases, lives. Hassan and Aerin looked at each other across the square for almost a full minute. Aerin did not raise the sword. He did not call the wind. He did not, dear viewer, do anything to Hassan al-Varakim at all. He simply looked at the fat man who had paid 12 copper coins for him 5 years ago, and he tilted his head very slightly to one side, as if examining a peculiar and disappointing specimen of insect, and then he turned and walked away. Hassan al-Varakim was found the next morning by an Imperial cleanup squad. He had not been killed, he had not been wounded. He had not, in fact, moved from the spot where he had been standing when Aerin walked away. He had been sitting in the dirt behind the empty cages for 14 hours. Fully alert, completely uninjured, and completely unable to make himself stand up. The cleanup squad had to carry him out on a stretcher. He never spoke another full sentence for the rest of his life. The guild records list his cause of death 3 years later as failure of the will. The physicians of the Southern Empire did not have a more specific term. By the time the sun set on the day of the Salt Wall, dear viewer, the slave market of Port Khazad-Vir was empty. The Iron Guard was still on the plain, half blind, half organized, trying to regroup. Chancellor Vorin Salkareth, who had watched the entire collapse of the Salt Wall through his brass spyglass, had turned his black horse around without saying a word and ridden north, toward a place that did not appear on any Imperial map, a fortress in the mountains called Vale Corum, the place the Council went when the Council needed to disappear. And Aerin Stormgrave, having walked 12 miles since dawn, having called a wind that had not blown across that plain in 800 years, having reopened the gates of the city that had branded him without spilling a single drop of blood, walked out of Port Khazad-Vir at dusk with 14,000 free people behind him, and sat down on the sand a mile outside the southern wall, because his legs would no longer hold him up. Aaliyah caught him before he hit the ground. This part, dear viewer, is the part nobody talks about. The chronicles of Port Khazad-Vir do not mention it. The Imperial records skip from quote, 56 directly to quote, 57 But I found it in a private journal kept by a freedwoman who had been one of the 3,000 in the cages, and who walked with Aerin's column for the next 2 years before she settled in a small town further south and lived out her days as a baker. She wrote the journal in her old age. She wrote about a lot of things. But the entry she wrote about the night after the fall of the Salt Wall is the one I want to read to you now. She wrote, "We made a fire in the dunes, a mile south of the city. Most of the people who had walked with us were too tired to eat. The Stormcaller sat in the middle of the fire ring with his back against a rock and his sword across his knees and his head down. The woman who was always with him, the one we called the cloth bearer, because she had used her own headcloth to wipe his blood off him the night the wind first came, sat at his right side. The gladiator sat at his left. The little girl who saw the future curled up against his hip like a cat and went to sleep. He did not eat for a long time. Then the woman tore a date in half and held it up to his mouth, the way one feeds a child. He took it. He chewed. He swallowed. The wind around him was very small. It was the size of a small breeze going through a window in summer. It was the smallest wind I had seen around him since the day in the market. After he had eaten, he reached down and he picked up a smooth stone from the sand. He drew a word in the sand at our feet with the stone. We watched him do it. The word was Aerin. He pointed at the word and then he pointed at himself. The woman nodded. The gladiator nodded. The little girl, who had woken up to watch, nodded. Then he drew a second word in the sand, below the first. The second word was Miriel. He pointed at the second word, and then he pointed at the sky. The woman put her arms around him. She did not say anything. None of us said anything. He cried for almost an hour without a sound, with his face against her shoulder. The fire burned down to coals. Nobody moved. When he stopped, he picked up the stone again and he drew a third word in the sand, very small, almost too small to read. The third word was, "Thank you." He pointed at it, and then he pointed at all of us, 14,000 of us, sleeping in the dunes around the fire, all of us free for the first time in our lives, and the wind around him got smaller and warmer, and then he closed his eyes and he slept for the first time in 11 days. I will remember that fire and that word in the sand until the day I die. That was the moment, dear viewer. That was the warm moment in the middle of the desert. The boy who had been bought for the price of 2 goats had walked back into the city that had sold him, and he had walked out with everyone who had been waiting to be sold next, and he had not killed a single person to do it. He had said his own name out loud for the first time in his life, even though he had said it without a voice. He had said his mother's name. He had said thank you to the people who had followed him. And somewhere, 1,000 miles to the north, in a fortress in the mountains called Vale Corum, Chancellor Wyl Stormgrave dismounted from his black horse in the cold courtyard, walked into a room that nobody else was allowed to enter, and stood in front of a heavy iron door. The door had 3 locks. He opened all 3 of them with 3 different keys. Inside the room, in the dark, something stood up. It had been standing up, by the way, for 63 years. It had not aged. It had not eaten. It had not slept. It had not, dear viewer, done anything except stand in the dark of that locked room and wait for the day Wyl Stormgrave would come and open the door. Because the contract that bound it to that room was a contract Stormgrave had signed. Because the contract that bound it to that room was a contract Stormgrave had signed in his own blood 63 years ago, on the same night Aerin fell, in a small chamber under the burning palace, with a creature whose name was not spoken in the Empire anymore. The thing in the dark room had been the price. 63 years ago, dear viewer, when Wyl Stormgrave was a young second-rank advisor with a chest of foreign gold and a freshly burned kingdom behind him, he had needed insurance. He had known, even then, that the bloodline of Aerin was old, and that old bloodlines have a way of growing back. He had known that even if he killed every living heir of the Stormcallers, every child, every cousin, every infant in a basket, there was still a chance, however small, that one of them would slip through. And if one of them slipped through, and if that one survived to adulthood, and if that one ever managed to call the wind the way the old kings had called the wind. Wyl Stormgrave's entire life, the marble desk, the white stone capital, the 41 years of quiet power would unravel like a thread pulled out of a sleeve. So he had made a contract. The thing in the dark room had a name. The name was not spoken aloud, because saying the name out loud was part of how the contract had been made, and Wyl Stormgrave had not survived 63 years of imperial politics by repeating the words of an old contract in a room where servants might be listening. But the thing had a name, and the thing had a face, and the thing had, when the contract was finally activated, a job to do. The job was to find the last Stormcaller and end the line. The thing in the dark room did not breathe. The thing in the dark room did not need to. It wore a mask of cold black iron, hammered in a shape that was not quite a human face, with 2 narrow slits where the eyes should be, and a horizontal line where the mouth should be. The mask had not been taken off in 63 years, because the thing under the mask was not, strictly speaking, a thing anyone would want to look at twice. The mask had been part of the contract. The contract had said, "You will wear this until the work is done, and the work will be done on the day the last Stormcaller is found, and on that day you may take it off, and on that day you may go home." The thing under the mask had been waiting 63 years to go home. Wyl Stormgrave stood in the open doorway and looked at it. "He is alive," he said. The thing under the mask did not nod. The thing under the mask did not move. But somewhere behind the horizontal slit where the mouth should be, there was a small sound, almost too soft to hear, that might have been a sigh, or might have been a laugh, or might have been something older and stranger than either. "He is 16 years old," said Wyl Stormgrave. He has called the wind on the plain at Khazad-dûr. He has broken the salt wall. He has freed 14,000 people, and he has done it without spilling a drop of Imperial blood, which is the part of this story I find most disturbing, because it means he is not yet what he is going to become. He is still trying to be a good man. The thing under the mask did not move. "That will not last," said Vorin Salkareth. "Good men do not survive what is coming. I want you to make sure of it. I want you to find him. I want you to make him into the thing he is afraid of being. I want him broken, not killed. Killing him only finishes the bloodline. Breaking him finishes the legend." Do you understand the difference? The thing under the mask, dear viewer, finally moved. It tilted its head, very slowly, to one side. The same tilt, in fact, that Aerin Stormgrave had used in the auction square of Port Khazad-dûr when he had looked at Hassan al-Varakim for the last time, as if examining a peculiar and disappointing specimen of insect. It was not a coincidence. "I will not ask again whether you understand," said Vorin Salkareth very quietly. "I will assume you do. Go." The thing under the mask walked past him, out of the dark room, across the courtyard, and out of the fortress of Vale Corum into the cold mountain night. It did not take a horse. It did not take a weapon. It did not, dear viewer, take a cloak against the cold, because it had not felt cold in 63 years and did not remember what cold was. It walked south on foot, in a straight line, in the direction of a fire in the dunes a mile south of Port Khazad-dûr, where a 16-year-old boy with no tongue had just fallen asleep against the shoulder of the only friend he had left in the world. The thing under the mask would arrive at that fire in 11 days. It would not find Aerin there. Aerin, by then, would have moved, but it would find something else at the fire. It would find a small word, written in the sand by the edge of the burned-out coals that had not yet been worn away by the wind. The word was a thank you, written by a boy who did not know how to write anything else. The thing under the mask would look at the word for a long time. The thing under the mask would, the chroniclers say, kneel down and put one iron-gloved finger on the word in the sand, very gently, as if testing whether the word was real. And then the thing under the mask would do something that nobody, not even Vorin Salkareth, had expected. It would weep. One single tear, dear viewer, just one. A small drop of clear water falling from behind the horizontal slit of the mask, landing in the sand on top of the word "thank you," soaking in, leaving a tiny dark mark that the wind would erase within the hour. But the moment that tear fell, the contract that had bound the thing under the mask for 63 years, the contract written in Vorin Salkareth's blood in a chamber under a burning palace, developed, for the first time in its long, terrible life, a crack. A small crack. A hairline crack. The kind of crack a stonemason would walk past without noticing. But cracks, dear viewer, do not stay small. Cracks compound. Cracks spread. Cracks, given enough time and enough pressure, bring down walls. And the wall that this crack was going to bring down, eventually, was the wall around Vorin Salkareth's entire 63-year-long life. The Iron Mask, dear viewer, was not going to do what he had been sent to do. The Iron Mask had been waiting 63 years to go home. But the Iron Mask, when he finally caught up to Aerin Stormgrave 6 weeks later in a canyon in the mountains south of Aramar, was going to discover that home was not the place he had thought it was. Home was not the village he had been taken from as a child 63 years ago. Home was not even the human face he had had before the mask was hammered onto him. Home was a small word in the sand, written by a boy who had been a slave, that had said thank you to the people who had walked with him. And the Iron Mask, dear viewer, was going to have to decide in that canyon 6 weeks from the night this story ends, whether to finish the job he had been sent to do, or whether to do the much harder and much more dangerous thing, which was to take off the mask for the first time in 63 years and become, again, the person he had been before. That is the story of Season 2, but that is not the story we are telling tonight. Tonight, dear viewer, we end here. We end at a fire in the dunes a mile south of Port Khazad-dûr. The fire is burning down to coals. 14,000 free people are sleeping in a loose ring around the coals. A woman named Aliyah ibn Marisi is sitting upright with her back against a rock, one arm around the shoulders of a sleeping boy. A man named Kale Drennick is sitting on the other side of the fire, awake, watching the dark, with his old sword across his knees. A 12-year-old girl named Sira Halvin is curled against the boy's hip, also asleep, her lips moving in a dream of something 3 days in the future. And the boy himself, the 16-year-old former slave whose tongue is gone, whose mother is dead, whose father is dead, whose teacher is dead. The boy whose real name is Aerin Stormgrave, 7th of his line, last surviving heir to the kingdom of Aerimar, the Stormcaller who broke the salt wall without spilling a drop of blood. The boy is asleep. For the first time in 5 years, he is sleeping without nightmares. The wind around him is very small, the size of a small breeze going through a window in summer, the kind of wind a mother makes when she leans over a cradle and breathes very softly on the cheek of a sleeping child. It is the wind, dear viewer, that his mother taught him. The medicine wind, the protection wind, the word she had been trying to finish saying on the night the raiders came. He finished it for her today. And somewhere in the cold mountains to the north, a man in iron and a man in marble are both, in their own ways, beginning to understand that the boy they thought they had killed 16 years ago is not going to stop until everything they built on top of his mother's grave is dust on the desert wind. That is where we leave him. That is where the saga begins. Hit subscribe to RiseArc, dear viewer, because every legend starts at 0, and this one, I promise you, is climbing fast. If this story moved you, even a little, drop a wind emoji in the comments. If you want to know what happens in the canyon 6 weeks from now, when the Iron Mask catches up to Aerin and has to decide whether to finish a 63-year-old contract or break it, hit the bell. If you want to meet Izel Salkareth, the Chancellor's daughter, the 3rd player on the board, the woman who is right now writing letters in her father's office that she hopes he will never read, stay close, because she walks onto the page in episode 1 of season 2. But before you go, dear viewer, I want to ask you something, because every legend I tell on this channel ends with the same question, and tonight is no different. Aerin Stormgrave was sold for the price of 2 goats. He was branded, he was silenced, he was taught every day for 5 years that he was nothing. And the world, Steve, the Empire, the markets, the men with the ledgers, was certain, all the way down, that he would never be anything else. He proved them wrong. He proved them wrong with a wind he had not been allowed to call, with a word he had never been allowed to finish, with a name he had not been allowed to remember. So the question I want to leave you with tonight is this. What is the word someone tried to take out of your mouth before you could finish saying it? Because that word, dear viewer, that one word, is almost always the thing you were put on this earth to say. Write it in the comments. Don't explain it, just write it. The wind, I promise you, is listening. I'll see you in the next story.